Hello, good evening. Welcome to another Royal Mile Whiskies tasting, although not whiskies this time. Apples in various forms with cider and cider brandy from the Somerset Cider Brandy Company. Before I bring in Matilda and Julian Temperley, I just thought I'd quickly point out the tasting order. Hopefully you've got some glasses lined up. We're going to start with the cider, that's the one in the 50 cl. Then we're going to have the ice cider, a very special single cask Somerset Cider Brandy 3-year-old in an ice cider cask, then the 5-year-old, the 10-year-old, and finishing with the Kingston Black apple aperitif and maybe a discussion of a few drinks. So that just allows you to line up your glasses appropriately. And before we start, I thought maybe a little bit of context and actually quite a personal context. My connection to Julian goes back 20 years. When I was buying whiskey for the Scotch Malt Whisky Society, a broker who was based in Bristol mentioned a chap who was distilling cider to turn it into cider brandy, which was really unheard of. There was no such category as cider brandy within the UK, so it's something akin to Calvados, but you can't call it that. But not only that, there were very, very few small distilleries. There was no craft distilling scene as such. Julian started making his cider brandy in 1989, I think. So it was already a decade old when I bought a cask and we sold it to our members at the Scotch Malt Whisky Society. And it went down very well. It was a great success. And to say thank you, Julian asked me down to speak at Apple Day, which sounded fun. 23 years old, 24 years old, I think it was, something like that. Not particularly experienced in public speaking, but it sounded like we'd, clink a few jars of scrumpy and bless a tree or something. I don't know. Anyway, so I went out in Bristol with my brother the night before, and we found an amazing Jamaican bar that was playing really good music till 3 a.m. And we turned up ashen-faced at the farm, me going ever whiter as I saw cars parked up and down the lanes and a huge crowd. And this was obviously a slightly bigger deal, this Apple Day, this celebration of the autumn harvest. And it was there when I had a warm-up cider that someone informed me that as guest of honour at Apple Day, I was following the footsteps of Paddy Ashdown, William Waldegrave, and Eddie Grundy from the Archers. So treading on some hallowed ground with not half a speech written on the back of a fag packet. But I think I got away with it. And I did that by talking about, really the direction of travel in food and drink then wasn't good. It was towards supermarkets having a dominant grip on all buying. And there seemed to be ever fewer brands and larger brands seemed to be dominating. And so I congratulated everyone on supporting this farm product of great quality. And we had a very nice time. And I think another measure of success is that my brother, who was even paler than me, even though his only job was to drink cider, but he did look like he was more likely to whitey. He caught the eye of one of Julian's daughters, not Matilda, who you'll meet later on, but Mary. And about 10 years later, I was back at the farm giving another speech for their wedding. And they now have 4 really lovely, slightly grubby children, including Rufus, who I understand it's his birthday today. So happy birthday, Rufus. So the point of that is to say it's a place very close to my heart. It's a beautiful place. I've had many good times there. And if it gets quite familiar, the chat today, that's because I've spent a lot of time with these guys. In fact, talking about the farm, I think to give you this final bit of context, I just want to show you this video, which is an aerial shot of the farm, probably taken by Henry, which is Julian's son. And that just gives you an idea of the beauty of the place. And, orchards as well, which are, a marvel. They are a beautiful thing, an orchard. Lots of animals and little bugs wandering around in there. If I look up here, this coming up here is the cider shop where they can sell you cider. Off the red brick building here, that's the actual farmhouse where they live. You can see some evidence of cider production there. This is the yard. And then we're coming up to Burrow Hill, which is what the farm's named after. This is the tree there where everyone, I think I've seen some people married under there a few times. You can see the beautiful view of the Somerset levels and all these orchards. And these are just some of Julian, his family's orchards, where he grows all his own apples. So hopefully that'll give you some idea of the beauty of the place. You can only imagine it in apple blossom time, all these trees filled with blossom. It's really spectacular. So that's my introduction out of the way. I hope you've already poured your glass of cider. Cheers. Let's bring in Julian. And Julian, oh, you're opening a bottle of cider right now. You're a bit behind. How are you, Julian?
I'm well.
Good. So you're joining us from the still house, and we'll talk a little bit about distillation later on, but those are the stills in the background. But let's start with the base product. You've got many thousands of trees there, many varieties of apple. How do you make your cider?
We start off with roughly 200 acres of orchard. We grow 40 varieties of traditional, what we call vintage cider apples. And the art and the craft of making cider, traditional cider, is blending the varieties to get the right sort of pH before fermentation starts. Our cider is all high tannin cider apples. And so we have a fine mouthfeel, a good depth, but we need more acid to blend with the high tannin apples. We need acid apples, and that's about 10 varieties. Altogether, there's possibly 200 to 300 recognized cider apple varieties, and some varieties change name depending upon which parish they're in. So an apple called the Black Dabinet in this area could be called a Radstock in Hereford, which complicates matters a bit. But cider making is rather like winemaking. You make champagne out of 3 varieties of grapes. You might take the varieties in different proportions. You might take them at different levels of ripeness, and that's the skill of the winemaker. And exactly the same way as cider making, you need to balance the different tastes by choosing different apples. We do that. And so when we're pressing apples, we can have all the colors of the rainbow. And that's important. Some people make cider with single varieties. On the whole, that's a heresy. A couple of varieties, it works. But the point of making cider is the point of using apples and only apples, and not indulging in naughty and unholy tricks.
You would, I suppose, the market that you came into was mass-produced cider with apple concentrate, lots of sweetening. And
the whole cider world is having a huge problem. When they banned alcopops or taxed them out of existence, producers all jumped into a class that they tax loophole, and started making what they call fruit ciders. So now you might take neutral apple concentrate from, say, China or Poland, and whap in some mango juice or passion fruit juice or something to give it flavor. Whap up the alcohol, and you produce a very sweet, interesting drink, possibly, aimed at sort of young girls. But it's ripped the mystique, it's ripped the heart, it's ripped the integrity, the provenance out of the cider industry. And in due course, the government will realize that producing alcohol in huge multinational companies for underage drinking is not particularly satisfactory. Exactly the same as alcopops were not actually particularly socially good idea. So we're going through a bad stage in the cider world, but the craft and artisan cider has got some sort of life left in it. And cider out of apples, we show people our orchards, and that is important. So this is our cider. This is a medium sweet cider or medium dry. Has a specific gravity of around about 1012. And so it's a high tannin. It's got a huge fat mouthfeel. This is carbonated. This is a commercial cider. And to me, it makes a very drinkable cider. It's not a wine, it's a cider. Cider doesn't have airs and graces, but it is a great jewel of English food and drink. It is vastly undervalued, underappreciated, and almost unknown. I mean, people are so used to the sort of factory.
I would agree. That was one of the things I was going to ask you: is how undervalued do you think cider is? And I think that's changing. There's some pretty wacky stuff going on at the kind of natural fine cider end. Some of it very good, some of it less so. But the fact that the grapes do have all their own character, the apples do have their own character, and you can view it as a wine in that kind of sense. So are there particular apples that you favour, and what kind of character do they bring?
Well, here we're hugely privileged, really. We live in one of the three what's called vintage areas where the terroir, French would call terroir, becomes the climate, the soil, the varieties, the tradition all come together. If you're in France, you might be on a road. One side of the road might be for the local chateau with terroir. The other side of the road will be deemed less quality and will go, say, to Tesco's table cider. Here, Kingsbury Episcopi apples have always sold at a premium. As a cider makers, I know that 2 miles away, there's orchards on different soil seam, different geology, and you can flog them to the cider companies, but it's best you don't use them for making cider. It will make a different cider, that's all. It's light, it has no tannin, but it will go perfectly well into an industrial factory. So this is a fat, rich cider, tasting of cider apples. And it is characteristic of the traditional West Country flavours. If we wrapped in sort of more brambly and dessert fruit, we could get more like a white wine. But we're not making white wine, we're making cider. And so that colour is natural. It hasn't been messed around with. Strength is natural. And this is a readily drinkable cider.
Absolutely. I've drunk so much of it over my life now, I almost find it impossible to judge it now with new eyes. But it's got great weight and grip on the palate, as you say. It's got this bittersweet balance. It's
and the flavors fill the mouth, and that is important. But we have a local variety called Dabinet, which is one of the very best apples. It needs sharper apples to go with it if you're making it into a cider. But it actually comes from a next door neighbour farm to here in about 1937. We things have Yarlington Mill, is also a Somerset apple, or Harry Master's Jersey, which is a Somerset apple. These are all heavily bittersweet varieties. We would normally put in with a Dabinet cider, this sort of cider, something like Kingston Black or Stoke Red to give it a bit of acidity. And then the yeast will ferment cleanly and better if the pH is right. Just like if you're planting barley for your wheat, you check up the pH of a soil before you sow the barley, because you get a better product at the end, because pH is important. So this is very drinkable. It's very popular. We sell it on the whole locally. Just at the moment, we've got a huge boom of interest. We're normally at this time of year at the Glastonbury Festival. And so people are buying extraordinarily large amount of cider on the internet, so they can sit at home at the weekend and imagine they're at Glastonbury. Unfortunately, the virus did for that. It's done for most things, but it's an unexpected boom. But
well, I'm sure it's not quite as much cider as you would have sold at the bus. And we'll see Matilda soon, who I imagine has been to Glastonbury every year of her life. You were at the very first Glastonbury, or was it the second one?
I think my wife was at the first one,
but you were selling at the second.
But by the second we were there, and then we were first started off. We were selling the organisers' cider, because all farms in Somerset used to those days make cider. It was dying, but otherwise, our little sort of village come town, there was 5 cider makers around it. In a number of years, there's been no cider makers, and now there's the interest again for younger producers. But there's half, I think, the cider makers that the customs know about live in Somerset. And there's a surprising amount of cider makers that the customs don't know about. And they also live in Somerset. The customs don't seem that bothered about that. But it means it's part of the culture. If you make cider in Somerset, you can sell it locally. People will come in and they might buy somebody else's cider and they say, this is better, this is worse, or whatever. But we don't have to boutique everything and send it to London for some sort of wine boutique. We are.
Well, that's your shop there, isn't it?
That's the sort of back end of the cider house. The shop is sort of around the corner. So we are what you call hillbilly cider makers, and I like that.
Yeah. But I mean, just coming briefly back to Glastonbury before we say hi to Matilda. I mean, I remember the first time I worked on the cider bus at Glastonbury, where you've got the stand effectively closest to the main stage, where you've been all but one, I think, of the Glastonburys, and the first one you went to, it was you and a milk truck, pretty much. I think were the only.
Yes, we've been there. As a farm, we've grown up with Glastonbury. Hopefully, we always will. But it's been the Glastonbury back in the 80s was a very different Glastonbury than it is today. But it's still an extraordinary PR exercise. When you came to Glastonbury, after 3 days in a tent, you can't tell really where the people come from. Normally, you see a customer and you make a judgment, whether his check will bounce or whether he's going to hit you. You make a judgment. And the Glastonbury, you can't make that judgment because 3 days in a tent, you can't really, all the normal signs of where somebody comes from vanish. But it is a very, very good, PR exercise. We meet people like you there.
Yeah, well, I was lucky to be working on that stand. And I do remember standing there and thinking, this is amazing. Thousands upon thousands of pints poured of a local product grown on trees. 10, 15 miles is it? I can't remember what you are from the gate, something like that. All consumed, driven in by tanker and piped into people's paper cups. And even when Glastonbury became a little bit more commercial on the food and drink dispensary side, the cider bus is still something that people feel like they have to visit at least once and have their pint. And I think that's really amazing. And some of it, what you are serving there is farmhouse cider. It's not carbonated. You can have dry do you call it medium or dry? I think you can have. And the dry is proper dry farmhouse cider. Quite a bit drier than this, but
we also have some sort of fairy godmother. And Glastonbury has possibly been over the years our fairy godmother. And it pays for a lot of mistakes. It buys us a new tractor. we're very sad to see it not there this year, and I think they're making plans, and every possibility is that they will succeed next year. But the Glastonbury, we also have a considerable market for cocktails, cider brandy cocktails. So when we come to the next stage, it's cider brandy, and the cocktails are things like ginger donkey or a whole range of donkey type products. So we have sort of normally some serious sort of cocktail people there, and it's become quite an important part of the marketplace. But it was, we say in the 80s, it was a bit dodgy. Then there was different people. But when you get a group of people now doing a distillery tour, you say, has anybody been to Glastonbury? And almost always, a couple of people put their hands up and said, yeah, it's us. And it's amazing. And they come from Glastonbury from Japan and Australia. And we went on holiday to Mexico, picked up two Argentine girls. I was with my wife, so it was respectable picking up. They were hitching.
Right.
Their next stage was to go to England because they wanted to go to Glastonbury. So we said, you can come to Glastonbury and we'll give you a job.
Great. Well, we should move on. We should move on and meet Matilda very soon. One quick, Tom Dennison, I've only just seen this. Was that the Star and Garter pub in Bristol where I stayed out too late? It absolutely was. And thank you, Tom, because I was trying to remember the name of it. It's a brilliant place. And just before we say hi to Matilda, I'm curious, out of all the bands, I've probably worked 2-3 years on the cider bus, I would say. Which main headlining act drank the most cider? Do you remember that? Because they all had their own different character. I remember Oasis, you get a certain crowd. Come back to me on that. We'll say hi to Matilda. Hi, Matilda.
Hi, everyone.
So, in fact, this is nice that we've got the cider bus in the back. One of the most famous boozy buses in the world. And this is Matilda, Julian's daughter, who is very involved in the farm now and the business. Lovely evening there. I can hear some birds tweeting.
The birds are tweeting. The sheep are bleating. And yeah, we've got the cider bus in the yard. So we have got our own pretend Glastonbury right here.
Brilliant. Ice cider. Do you want to tell us about ice cider?
Yes, I will tell you about ice cider. So ice cider, when we first started doing ice cider, Julian made this ice cider, and we couldn't decide when we first started if it was really delicious or not, just terrible. And anyway, we did about 3 months and realized that the whole family had drunk about 400 bottles. So we better actually start making some more. And the idea is very much the same as ice wine. So we have the juice of a single apple, which I won't tell you the name of, it's top secret, but it's a special apple to us. And we freeze that juice, and then we take off the concentrated juice after the white ice is formed. And you're left with, say, 20% of the juice that went into the freezer. And that concentrated juice then goes into small barrels and it is fermented into ice cider. So although it's purely a cider, it tastes like dessert wine. That's where it fits really on the table. And I'm going to pour myself a glass.
And you probably chill it slightly as well, like a dessert wine.
Chill it or have it over ice. And what you have here, if you have a taste, and it has an incredible sweet start, but it's got a really, really full body, lots and lots of tannins, and then you've actually got quite a dry finish. So it feels the end is much more refined than the beginning. But people, when they like this, go completely wild for it.
It's got a lot. I mean, the appleiness is very different to the appleiness in the cider we had before. It's almost like a red dessert apple, and almost slightly cherry-like as well. The fruitiness is really, really different.
It's from a special bitter sharp apple, so it's a very well balanced apple. You've got the tannins in there, and you've got the sharpness in there, so you can have this full mouthfeel without it being too cloying.
And a good base in drinks, I would imagine, as well.
Cocktail makers absolutely love it, and I think the Financial Times once said it should be the first go-to for any mixologist. So it really holds its own. You couldn't really put a normal cider in cocktails because it would just disappear, but this is great for cocktails.
So just to summarize then, so the juice is concentrated through the process of freezing, and then you add the yeast to ferment it. I suppose we didn't really talk about fermentation with Julian earlier on, but very basically fermentation is the addition of yeast. Yeast eats the sugar and produces alcohol. So you've got a more intense amount of sugar, more sugar for the yeast to feed on, producing a stronger alcohol. Is that right?
That's right. But then because you have so much, because it's concentrated, the sugars then stop it fermenting. They retard the yeast, and so it doesn't go all the way through, which is why you've got this natural sweetness left behind.
Right, so it doesn't fully ferment.
Exactly.
So there's residual sugar left behind, which is, I suppose, if we're talking about normal cider, the fact that the sugars in apple are able to fully ferment is why you can produce such a, at times, almost brutally dry product, because the sugars are entirely fermented out. Is that right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. That's the traditional English method of making cider, is you ferment until it's totally dry.
Yeah.
And then it stops because it gets to a certain alcohol content, and the yeast will stop working, and they won't get the rest of the sugars.
So we had a little chat about the order to do these things in, but I suppose it's going to lead on to the next one, because we're the first cider brandy we're going to try has been matured into casks that held the ice cider. So is this the point after you have fermented it and turned it into ice cider, you're then maturing it, or are you fermenting it in these oak casks?
We're fermenting and maturing, so it's sitting in these oak casks. We might actually swap casks at one stage, and then it sits there, and it actually takes a really long time to do, because for the yeast it doesn't like to do very fast with cider. It's in the cask for a year and a half. As I see, Jenny says she likes it.
Yeah, Jenny's a big whiskey gal. She likes it very much. So we lost you slightly there, but I think we've got the kind of gist of it. Was I right in saying you've been to every Glastonbury of your life, including being a baby?
Yes, we all have, apart from your sister-in-law, who was giving birth to Rufus, actually, on one Saturday of Glastonbury, and that was her only year not going.
All right, you must be feeling it a bit. It's hopefully it's going to rain at the weekend. That'll make it a bit easier, would it?
Well, hopefully it's going to be sunny, and we're going to all stand around drinking cocktails from the bus.
Yeah, okay. I struggle to not go to Glastonbury if it's sunny, but then I guess it won't be on the telly, so I can live with it. Okay, cool. Well, I think we need to be talking about distillation soon as well. But before we do, so your role now, you're involved in the business side, also production as well.
Yeah, so at the moment we've just between distilling. We finished distilling in May, and then me and Paul, another guy that works here, will start distilling again maybe in August. If we have a wet, cold patch in August, we'll do some distilling. Otherwise, we'll wait till the autumn, and then come October. Beginning of October, we'll start harvesting, and that will go right through to Christmas. So at the moment, we're just looking after the cider and shuffling it around, and
And I suppose you're fitting that in around the cycle of ordinary cider production as well. So it starts to get very busy from late summer through into late autumn, I imagine. Would it? Is that the cycle of the season?
Yeah. So our season is late. So we start in October, and we peak season is probably the end of October, the very middle of November, and then we carry on through till Christmas. And then as soon as the first cider has fermented to dry, then we start distilling. So we're sort of full steam ahead between October and March, really.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Someone just put Ian Brown popping up here, who we know, and his partner is from. She's a Québécois, so I feel bad not mentioning the historical. Well, it's not even that old, is it? Really, ice cider as a category as a production, but it does originally come from Canada, and principally French Canada, I think. So is it late 90s, something like that? They started making ice cider, I think.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of ice cider makers in Canada, but we always ask the Canadians. They always drink ice wine, but none of them have really often heard of ice cider.
Right, because they're making ice wine as well there.
Yeah.
And I suppose if we're talking about the seasons as well, we should pop up some Blossom, which is a really magical time in the orchards. It just does look spectacular.
That is a magic time. That was not this year. That was the year before. In the orchards, we didn't have such good blossom this year.
Right. Okay. Okay. Cool. Well, I think as we move on to distillation, let's bring your old man back. See you in a short while, Matilda. Hi, Julian.
Hi.
So, next dram is the first dram, I suppose, as we would call it in whiskey terms, is the 3-year-old in an ex-ice cider cask. So, I was really excited when you guys mentioned that you had stock maturing in ice cider casks, because it was not something I had heard of before. Did you come up with this idea yourself to use ice cider casks?
We had the ice cider casks. We put ice cider into new Allier barrels, and
which is a French oak.
French oak. Allier is a very tight grade oak, Central, possibly one of the best. Limousine releases its flavors quickly. It's a wider oak. Allier is more sophisticated. If we tried a blind tasting, I'm not certain I'll get the answer right, but I'll stick with that. We use quite a lot of Allier oak. It seemed like a good idea at the time. We were looking for a barrel of interest, and so we put the ice cider. The problem with ice cider is you get it fermenting first. You encourage it one way or another, because it takes quite a lot of starting, because but once it starts, it takes a long time to finish. And it's ice cider, the cask makes sort of sense, and the ice cider comes through.
Yeah, conceptually, which is when you hear about something, how much do you want to try it, I suppose, is conceptually sounds a bit posh. But I just loved the idea that it was kind of like apples cubed. I mean, in a mathematical sense, not, diced up. I mean, it was like apple casks, cider brandy. Wow. And although this is young, I just love the kind of purity of apple flavor. And generally speaking, I like your spirit 3, 5, 6, 7, 8 years old. I like the youth of your cider brandy spirit. I like the freshness of the apple, the cidery nature of it. And then this just has this light, sweet hug from the cider brand, the ice cider cask as well. I'm really impressed by it.
This is the nose is extraordinarily beautiful, and it's absolutely fresh, absolutely clean, and
there's a kind of clarity, a kind of purity of the appliness, which as we get further up the age range, then there's no doubt they're very fine brandies, but you're starting to get more of that influence of the oak, and it starts to become that kind of battle or that harmony between oak and spirit. But this is just pure, clean, freshly cut apples, Granny Smiths and things like that, but Coxes but fresh apples.
I think apple can be, it's fruit, and this is quite clearly apple. This is 3 years old. When it's 5 years old, it'd be a little bit smoother. This is 46%, so it's quite strong.
Yeah, I should have said that. I've tried it once, and it does take a little bit of water, but it's bottled stronger than your normal cider brandies.
A normal cider brandy is 42.
Mm.
That was when we started, and I think it will stay 42. But this is an extraordinary amount of flavour transfer in a remarkably short length of time, really. And I think that it's got oak as well. And oak sometimes masquerades a bit like apple. But one of the things we're doing here is using a lot of different barrels. And we found some alarming problems not problems possibly, but we've got some very expensive barrels, and they're wonderful. And so we spend a lot of money on different oaks. Quite a lot of oak has had sherry in it, but other oak hasn't. And but good barrels now are very, very hard to, they're costing a lot of money.
I guess we're probably going to talk about casks a little bit more when we talk about 5 or 10 or the other traditional types of casks. But this is unusual and really interesting to use an ice cider cask, and I'm really captivated by it. And we've pretty much signed up to do our own exclusive bottling of it, which should come out late summer, I would say. And I'm really interested to see how it develops. I think we're not quite bottling off the whole cask, and there might be the possibility of maybe bottle the rest off a little bit later on. But I think it's a great and really interesting product. But I'm going to go back on a question, actually, because Mike Woodward Gregg, do you use commercial yeast for fermentation, or, if at all, wild yeasts on the apples?
We use a champagne yeast for most of our fermentation. In Latin, it's called the cider yeast. You can read Latin. We have wild yeasts on apples, but they're not on the whole fermentable yeasts. The apple normally gets its fermenting yeast from the orchard floor or orchard equipment. So if we're filling up, say, a vat of cider, which might take 5,000 gallons, to bung a little bit of yeast in seems to be a reasonably good insurance that you don't get a bloody awful yeast turning up. But what we're really interested in yeast behavior is its flocculation. When it's finished fermenting, it settles down, and so you can rack it off, and it settles down clear at the bottom. The yeast drops out. Then you take off the top part, and it's a clear yeast. When the cider ferments with the wild yeast, more often than not, you get a yeast which hangs around quite happily, slightly living enough just to keep itself a bit buoyant. And so it's there in getting in the way of flavour all the way through. if the yeast we add becomes the dominant yeast, I'm quite happy. But if other yeasts turn up and are vigorous enough to beat up our yeast that we add, we're also quite happy. What we don't want is a sort of yeast can produce all sorts of byproducts. I know one cider maker has a natural yeast on his farm that produces hydrogen sulfide and rotten eggs, which is a problem. We have other yeasts which produce naturally sulfur dioxide. They're quite high level. And if you have that, you really can't distill it because that will attack the copper. But we like to make a very clean cider. And the amount of money we spend on yeast, I think, is well worth it.
Mm-hmm.
The orchard floor is a jolly good place to find yeast, I suppose, but it's not a very reliable place to find the sort of yeast that we want.
So you're to answer the question, you use commercial yeast, but you're aware of natural yeast also contributing and sometimes trying to screw things up.
Yeah, and if it takes over a vigorous natural yeast, beat up our added yeast, and then it will go straight forward to fermentation. We don't really want to stop fermentation, and we don't want to produce a whole range of off products. We don't want yeast left over from last year's cider making on equipment. We will continue to use yeast.
So our yeast question took up a little bit of time. So Matilda, I think you've drawn the short straw. You've got to explain distillation.
Oh, okay.
So
well,
I wonder, is this diagram useful?
That looks just like our stills. We have 3. We've got a new one that came in last May, and we've got Josephine, Isabel, and Fifi, and they're all 1950s French ladies. There's Julian in between, Josephine on the left, and Fifi on the right. And they're amazing stills. So the cider goes in the top at 6%. They're coffee stills. It comes in on the left-hand side, and it gets superheated. It comes up. It goes through to it comes in on the right-hand side. I'm never very good at my right and my left. And then it goes through to the left, and it drops through the columns. And each of those lines is a little bubble plate, and it gets separated out. So all the high volatiles come off the top, and all the denser ones come off the bottom, and what you get coming back across the tube at the top and being condensed by the cold cider coming in the other side is your heart spirit. So we take off the stills between 68 and 72%. That's what the eau de vie comes out at from our 6% cider. So it's a long old process. And what you have is, although our stills are essentially the same, each of them does have its own characteristic. Fifi is a little bit more fruity, and Josephine's fatter. And so you sort of think to yourself, well, Josephine will put down a spirit that's maybe really good for long aging, and Fifi is really, really especially good for eau de vie because she's pure fruit, and then Isabel is somewhere in between the two. So we have all the same type of stills because it's really part of our distillery characteristic. And you can argue about whether column stills are good or pot stills are good, but the idea of these column stills is that because you're pulling out at between 68 and 72%, and you're doing it the once, what you're getting is something very, very fruit forward. And we're all about the apple, as everyone's just discovered.
Yeah.
We were so excited.
Sorry, I was going to ask: is it quite consistent, the spirit as it runs off the spirit of the stills, or are there variations? And kind of what's causing those variations? Is it what's happening in the field or in the orchard, I should say, or or what?
There's certainly variations year to year and in how the stills run. I think whenever the hot year was, the stills ran really fast because the cider was much stronger. The stills don't really like cider if it's below sort of 5.5%. So there's variations in what it tastes like year to year, but actually it's all in the apples really. It's in the harvest, and we had such amazing cider going through them this year that it was hard not to drink it when you were testing it. But this is the ice cider, and the 3-year-old matured in the ex-ice cider cask. And when you asked us about it, we'd actually just done our first ever proper tasting of it, which was quite exciting, because this is just pure apple. This is a refined version of what the distillery smells like during distilling time.
Yeah, we had some long chats. You sent us some various samples, some that were a bit older, but the oak that the ice cider went into on some of the older ones was actually new oak, and this was refill oak that had been used for something. And I like that.
Yeah.
I like that cleanness of it. There's a little bit of oak from these refill casks, but it's very, very subtle. Just a tiny bit of maybe bitterness I'm getting maybe from that, but I like that refill oak.
So this is refilled, but it's not just it's the barrels were first cider brandy, then they were ice cider, and now they're cider brandy again. So it's infused in apples just before it even got to the ice cider stage.
Yeah, so it's probably a good time to move on to the 5-year-old,
yes.
Which would have some fresher oak in there when you smell it, and also a bit more time. So there's more time for this maturation process for the oak to have more influence in the spirit, and already is it too simplistic to just say as you get a bit older the spirit start to taste, the appley flavors start to taste more like cooked apples? I mean, it just seems that way. The younger, the fresher the spirit, and then as you get started getting closer to this kind of apple crumble or stewed apple kind of thing.
No, that's pretty much it. There's something incredibly floral about this 5-year-old as well. It smells like the orchards in springtime, and it's more floral, I think, than the ex-ice cider barrel we just tasted. And
are there bourbon casks in here as well? I'm getting
no. We have no. No. We have only just we've just started experimenting with some some American white oak, but it's only last year, so we don't have it in any of our products yet. Right.
So French oak.
French oak, often second fill for the 5-year-old, because we want the apples to talk in the 5-year-old, and not the apples, not the barrels.
We lost you for a tiny moment. Can you just say that last sentence again?
I was just saying it's often second fill that we use for the 5-year-old, and we want it's the apples that we want to do most of the talking in this one as well. So the oak becomes very secondary in the 5-year-old.
Yeah, I think that's why it's my favourite, but that's partly a price thing as well. I think it's such good value. Well, you're still well below 40 quid, 35-ish, something along those lines from memory.
Yeah.
Which, when you're comparing that to your French cousins, Calvados, an age-stated fine Calvados is I would say probably beyond that. And I just think it's a super, super value spirit for that. And it's already mature. There's no doubt about it. There's some youthfulness on the 3-year-old, but it's already mature.
I love this one. This is my favorite. I always describe it to people as a daytime brandy, but I don't think that's necessarily a good thing for most people. Yeah. Whereas if you speak to Julian, he will always prefer a 10-year-old. I'm sure he'll tell you about that and why in a minute.
Most people are furloughed, so daytime brandy is fine, I think, nowadays, isn't it? That's great, and thank you for your explanation of distillation. That's really helpful. How many casks are going into a batch of this when you're putting it together?
Well, it's not very many. So when we are doing a tasting, we probably will taste about 10 casks, and then we'll pull about 3. And yeah, that's as many as we bottle in one go ever. So we've just done a tasting of something, and we've tasted, I think, 15 casks, but we'll only ever pull 3 or maybe even just 2 from that. So every cask for us gets tasted every year. If you can hear a noise, I've got a paramotor flying above my head.
All right, okay. Well, let's bring in Julian to talk about the 10-year-old, I'd say. So, Julian, you must be very proud to have a 10-year-old cider brandy. I mean, you've had 20 in your stocks as well. Although I think that's pretty much all gone, isn't it? The 20-year-old. You struggle to keep up with that.
We are moving up in age. This year we ended up making some changes in the policies that we had, but we got away with Christmas to the skin of our teeth. We had 1 cask of 10 years old in reserve, which was, and because we are PGI, we are heavily audited by the PGI, which is European authorities. But we are looking at our average age to be somewhere around about between 8 and 10 years old. But we still have a 20 years old we need. But one thing we did mention earlier was Calvados. We are a friendly cousin of Calvados. We're not making Calvados. But we've got incredibly good relations. And when we were in Europe, Calvados came to our protection before our government did, and which was very important. And so we are, the Somerset cider makers and the French have a common interest. What's good for apples and orchards is good for them. But what I do have here is a book. I don't know whether you can see it. It's called The Treatise to Cider, and it was published in 1668. And I had to take this to Brussels once because there was some dispute about our name. And on page 190, it says, you may, after due fermentation, extract spirits, commonly called brandy, in great plenty, very excellent, quick and burning. It being usual for cider when old to burn over a fire as claret or other French wine, etc., etc. Under the headline, The Makings of Cider Brandy. And this is very important because it means we have a history going back in the cider world for the last 400 years. And it's only really in the last 100 years that we've largely vanished. But we are possibly the only quantity makers of cider brandy in the UK. But that story of making it 400 years ago is important because it protects us from those that question our credentials. But anyway, we were talking about 5 years old.
Well, I'm on to the 10-year-old now myself. But although as we enjoy the brandy, I was curious when you started distilling 1989. Was I right in saying that?
87 and a bit earlier, but that was sort of unofficial.
Oh, right. Okay, we won't go into that. I think you're probably in the clear now, but so when you were distilling and trying to set up a distillery, who was there to offer you advice? How did you learn? There's no precedence around you. Did you go over to France and have a poke around there, or did you read from books, or how did you do it?
Read books about whiskey. We visited France. Distilling is once you committed. I think the customs said, when they realised our determination to end up with a distillery, they said, well, in that case, we'll do it. But I mean, as a we essentially steal anything of anybody. Our input to the equation is the apple and cider traditions of the West Country. And I think that is justifiable. I mean, we make it 10 years old. This 10 years old is rich, got a lovely nose, it's got a beautiful body. It's an after dinner brandy. And if you've had, you can drink this alongside any product that comes from France. This comes from apples and orchards, and the style we're looking for is possibly different. I mean, Calvados is a very broad church. You've got wonderful Calvados. You've got a lot of average Calvados, and you've got some which is purely made for the oaky market. But this is what we were looking for. We aged some of this to 20 years old, which we just need. But this is fat. I mean, in a way, there's apples in there, but they're different sort of apples. They taste different to the 5 years old. These, Gilly Goulden once was reviewing one of our products and said something like, this has got hairy armpits and a hairy chest. She declared that she loved it, but it wasn't quite clear why hairy arms got anything to do with it. But it sounded.
Well, that's Gilly's business, I think, isn't it? That's whatever Gilly likes.
But so this is what we were looking for. I mean, ultimately, when we started distilling, looking back on it, it was essentially a vanity project. Since then, it's absorbed most of our farming activities, and we've got endless experiments we can do over time. But
the cider that goes into the stills, that's probably a question I should have asked already, but that is different to the cider that you're selling as drinking cider, carbonating for sparkling cider. You are making a product specifically to be distilled.
Yes.
Is that right? Yeah.
We're selecting the apples variety-wise and treating them with great care. We treat all our apples with great care, but we select the apples for distilling from the tree, from where we're getting the apples from. We could always put them back into the cider world if we felt like it, but we would select from the beginning. And on the whole, we're looking for something which is basically a top quality juice cider. We have a lower. It is our primary product if we're distilling, but it's also a matter of having enough apples for cider making and enough apples for distilling. But we designate the vats on the day, and that plays various other important roles with the councils and things like that, rates and. But there's no market in taking a dodgy cider and distilling it. There's a full supply. You can produce alcohol, spend vast amounts of alcohol or storage, and produce something which we don't like. We put our best foot forward here all the time.
Well, distillation, if nothing else, is a focusing of flavour, isn't it? It's a increasing of intensity of flavour. So if you start with poor flavour, you're just going to get more of it.
Yes, and then there's no point in spending vast amounts of money and time on barrels. But that lesson is would seem to be fairly obvious, but if we have dodgy cider, we would turn it into cider vinegar, which goes into crisps. So we have an outlet for stuff like that. And sometimes we make a mistake. Sometimes a vat brings a leak. Sometimes something goes wrong. But on the whole, it's we produce fairly consistent. It's important.
Well, it's a delicious, fine aged spirit. There's no doubt about it. Did you remember which of the band's followers drank the most cider at Glastonbury? Oh, Matilda's putting her hand up. Matilda, you can take that question.
So we had Richard Hawley once, and he drank so much cider, and he said he'd never experienced anything like it before he went NA. And anyway, someone on the bar, they scrawled all up his arm in felt tip pen in actually indelible marker, and then he went on tour, and he wears a usually used to sort of rockabilly type, wears a short sleeve shirt. So he, for his whole tour, couldn't wear a short sleeve shirt because he had sort of cider bus scrawlings all over his arm.
Oh, okay. I meant the actual crowds that followed.
Oh, the crowds.
Because you got such different character working on that bus,
yes.
Depending on who was playing. Suddenly, the Oasis fans would wash in, and then the Dolly Parton fans would come in.
The Dolly Parton ones were cider drinkers. As all the sort of really old classics are cider drinkers. The young crowd don't really understand what traditional cider is. So yeah, it's generally the older bands, any kind of rocky bands, they're all cider drinkers.
Right.
And
okay.
The sort of classics.
So let's try the Kingston Black aperitif. So this is a drink effectively you guys have invented. There is a precedent for it, maybe. It's a bit like a pommeau, not quite like a pommeau.
This isn't aged like a pommeau, but it's like a Flotte de Gascogne or a Pinot de Charente. It's the same thing. So this is made with our cider brandy and the juice of the Kingston Black apple. And the Kingston Black apple is a really important apple for us. I think we're probably the people that grow the most of it. It loves these orchards behind us. An orchard here of Kingston Black will establish itself in about 15 years. It will look like a 30-year-old tree anywhere else. And it's a bitter sharp apple. And this is pure Kingston Black.
Yeah. So, and you've got that fresh juice character back all of a sudden.
That's it. Delicious. This is pure and fresh and just out of the orchards. If you can really see where it comes from if you taste a Kingston Black apple. And in fact, behind the cider bus, you'll just see there is a tree. That there is a Kingston Black tree.
All right, okay.
So Kingston Black's an apple that people don't really like to grow commercially because it only properly fruits every other year. It's susceptible to all sorts of nasties. So it's a bit of a mercurial grower. Only really grows where it wants to grow, and but we're heavily invested in the Kingston Black apple.
That's delicious. Such a juicy drink. And you use this a lot as an ingredient in mixed drinks, I believe.
Yes, we do. It's this is great. It's actually my favourite way to drink this is just with tonic, just Kingston Black and tonic, and a slice of lemon is perfect. We also use it like a Pimm's, we do something called orchard mist. Lemonade, fruit, a bit of mint. That's really good as well.
In fact, I put some lemonade in the fridge for after this is over, so I'm going to go and have something similar to that. Well, one other just thought I had when I was walking around today was how effortlessly, easy for me to say, cider production is as an environmental thing.
Yeah.
Relatively low energy to make. It doesn't require enormous amounts of heat. You've got all the fruit all around. Those orchards are surrounded by long grass, lots of beasties. You've got a flowering plant I'm sure the bees love. And compared to beer and whiskey, where you're transporting bulky grain a long way.
Yeah.
But yet people don't really discuss it as such, weirdly, but it's got so much going for it from an environmental angle.
It's funny because recently I've seen there's a new movement which is called sort of sustainable spirits, and I can't quite work out why anything's sustainable, but we are as sustainable. They take a long time to mature. You don't pull so much off them, but they can happily live in the orchards. You don't need to add anything. We don't use any insecticides or any nitrogen. So we plant maybe 40 trees an acre, and they take 25 years to peak. And I think I did a tour in America, and they were planting 1,200 trees per acre routinely, but the ground obviously can't sustain that. You have to add things. You have to control pests. So we have super low intensity orchards. All of our apple pomace, which is the apple cake when the juice has been pressed out of it, that goes and it feeds the wildlife. And we are this autumn just about to start growing oak trees for use in barrels, but it's a bit of a dream because we won't be able to harvest them for 130 years. So we're in for the long term.
Wow. He's hoping for some big advancements in medical science, and I could maybe taste that one. But you just, obviously, as a buyer of spirits, as a buyer of drinks, we're often presented with this argument that we should buy a certain drink because of its sustainability, because of its environmental credentials. But right under our nose in England, and to a lesser degree Scotland, Wales has lots of cider production. We have this drink that every pint you have is a better option than all the other drinks around it. The other drinks seem to be having to retool themselves to become sustainable, where there's something naturally incredibly sustainable about cider.
Yeah, I think so. Our food miles are about 100 meters from the orchard to the press, and then maybe then into the distillery and down to the bond. So cider the traditional cider orchards are a totally unique environment. They're an amazing place to be. I can hear woodpeckers every morning. There's loads of owls. There's deer. We put up with the deer, but they do like eating young trees. It is an amazing place for wildlife, these orchards.
Yeah, they're beautiful places. Well, I think we should all drink more cider and drink more cider brandy. Is that the general consensus? Drink more cider?
Sounds good to me.
I think. Anyway, let's drink a toast to the apple orchard.
Yeah. Cheers, guys.
I've got 10 years old. What's Matilda got?
I'm on the Kingston Black. Arthur, what's going to be your tipple?
Well, if I'm choosing, I'm going back to this 3-year-old because I really want to see this in bottle and with our name on it because I think it's a real discovery.
We end up with you with the 3 years old, Matilda with the 5 years old, and me with the 10 years old, which roughly marries up to our ages. So thank you.
Well, we do actually, right at the death, we have a surprise guest coming in.
Oh.
Would you believe it? Your dear friend, Mr. Mark Hicks, is joining us. Hi, Mark.
Hi, Mark.
Sorry for the mess up.
That's all right. Okay. So Mark Hicks is a big friend of the family and also a great pourer of their drinks, a mixer of their drinks in his very fine restaurants. You might recognize him from the telly and things like that. And he was promising to make us a drink.
I'm going to. I've got everything ready.
Have you? Well, all we can see is your ceiling, mate.
Temperley. Hang on. Can you see? Let me put this over there. Is that good?
Yeah.
Can you see?
Well, we can see kind of you. Yeah, more or less.
Hang on.
There we go. That's perfect.
Let me go closer.
That's good-ish. So I think Mark, just while he gets setting up. So Mark,
I'm alone, so I can't really hold it. Hang on. Let me put a bowl in the front.
So
is that good?
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, we can see. Yeah. So just while he's setting up, so Mark, obviously you've probably heard of him. He's got some very fine restaurants which have obviously been closed during this weird time. I think to keep himself busy.
Closed down.
Yeah.
Closed down.
But to keep himself busy, he's been selling fish out of a van. Is that right, Mark?
Yeah, I've been selling fish from the local fishermen, and just fish from Lyme Regis, and selling outside of Felicity's farm shop.
Right. And you got a lot of fish moved?
Yeah, we're selling quite well. It's quite hard being a fishmonger. I'm going to get an ice cube.
All right, okay. He's getting an ice cube. Well, while he's doing that, I'll tell you about, firstly, I'll tell you what everything costs if you want to buy anything. No, I can't find that. Don't worry about that. It's not commercial. It's just for fun this evening. But we do have all these products for sale. But I could just tell you about the next tasting we've got coming up. So tomorrow with Dave Broom, prominent whiskey writer, and Adam Park, filmmaker, I'm going to introduce them, and they're going to stand well back. But they're going to be doing a director's half-cut drink-along screening of their whiskey documentary, The Amber Light, which you can buy on Vimeo, set up on one screen, and then we'll be doing a similar thing tonight, trying a number of drams and just talking over the film. God knows how it's going to work, but it should be fun. But we've got a lot of feedback when we've been doing these whiskey tastings that just covering the basics would be a nice thing. So I'm going to do a whiskey tasting like that. There's a pack on sale now, I think, on our website, choosing 5 really interesting whiskies. And then using video, using pictures, introducing some guests, and doing a little taste along. We're going to do a kind of quick and dirty shortcut guide to understanding whiskey. There's a lot of common mistakes that people getting into whiskey kind of make. I think, don't learn that, learn it like this. So I'm going to try and guide people into getting a head start in understanding whiskey. So that's the plan. Mark, how are you getting on?
Good, I'm there. So we're
Good
going
man.
to make a Temperley sour.
Okay.
Julian and Matilda know what that is. I'm just trying to get the cherries open. There we go. So really simple. Ice cube, lemon juice. These are all Temperley products apart from the lemon juice. A little bit of apple juice. Egg white. So it's based on a whiskey sour, obviously, this, but it's a West Country one. Some Kingston Black. And of course, some cider brandy.
Which one are you using there, Mark? Which cider brand are you using?
So this is the 15-year-old.
Oh, posh.
I've got a whole range, but I thought tonight we should have a 15-year-old. Okay, so just shake it up like a good old whiskey sour. In goes a cherry in Julian's apple eau de vie, and a little bit of the juice on top. Cheers.
Cheers, Mark. Thanks for joining us. I hear you had a tough day, and well done for bombing it across the country and making yourself a drink straight in the door. But I know.
Did you get that?
Yeah, no, we got it all. We got it all.
Good. Sorry about earlier. I was driving madly. But, yeah, when you're a fishmonger, I had to go and collect some whelks and oysters from pool and some clams.
Right. Okay. And you've been a big supporter.
And now I cook the whelks.
You've been a big supporter of their products. You've even got something called the Hicks Fix. I understand it. Is that right?
Yeah. So the Hicks Fix has been our house cocktail for 12 years or more. So that again is the cherries in the apple eau de vie, and currently we're using Hambledon. Sparkling, and sometimes we use Furley, sometimes we use Castlewood. It depends.
Great.
That's when I've got a restaurant that's open.
Right. And what's the timeline on that? Middle of next month, is it? Or when do you think?
Cracking up.
When do you think you'll be reopened? No, we've lost Mark. We've lost him.
I'm not sure yet.
Right. Anyway, I think we've had a lovely evening. We should say goodbye. Let's see if we get back for one last toast. Cheers, guys. Thanks for coming.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Arthur. That was well hosted.
Thank you,
my pleasure. Yeah, thank you, Mark. Cheers. So once again, thank you everyone for watching, and Matilda and Julian's products are available from us or direct from them. There's nothing wrong with that. I learned loads about cider and cider brandy. Just a few last comments coming in. Cheers all. Thanks, Mike. Lots of good comments. Really appreciate that. And I'm glad you enjoyed the 3-year-old ice cider cask, actually. Where can we buy it? So me and Matilda were just talking actually about the last bits of commercials on that. It's still actually in wood, and we're hoping to get that bottled up in July and on sale by the mid-July, probably, maybe the end of July. And we're trying to get it 46%, 50 cl, $28.95, which I think is a really good price. And because I've just said it live, then Matilda has to stick to that now. And then Richard, thank you. I also had a great evening. Drink more cider. Exactly. Please bottle the 3-year-old ice cider cask. There we go. And yes, keep these online tastings going even when back to normal. I'll agree with that. I think I really like the format. So thanks, everyone. That's the end of this evening. Maybe see you soon for something similar. Cheers. Bye.